In this second part of the series, I will talk about how I first learned editing programs, then how I progressed. I hope this helps someone who are looking to start learning editing. I considered talking about editing in general too, the grammar, structure, different types of cuts, transitions and stuff, but that would have made it too long, so I will make a separate video. In 2005, I started playing with cameras. At the same time, I began editing what I shot, or tried to anyway. Again, I was lucky my school had a room full of Mac computers with editing programs and DV tape decks. I practically lived in that tiny Mac lab for most of my uni days. I was also very lucky that one of my friends at uni was really good at editing and she was willing to answer every little question I had. If I recall correctly, there wasn't much info available online in those days, or at least I didn't know how to find them back then. So it was harder to learn programs and solve problems on my own. I had to rely on books and other people to learn. For the most part of the first year, I used iMovie. iMovie had a really simple interface and relevantly easy to figure out as a beginner. I was usually able to explore around the menu and find the functions I needed on my own. At this time, I practiced making simple edits, played with very simple graphics, even made my own music in GarageBand to use in videos. My edits at the time were atrocious, just a train wreck after train. I can't, but it was good practice. And I think because I started with such a simple program, it was easier for me to grasp the concept of a timeline. And this helped me to ease into more complicated editing platforms. As my projects evolved and got more complicated, I needed more functionality and power, and I had to move on. I started learning Final Cut, which was also available on those school computers. I remember at first it was much more intimidating because it looked so different. Lots of grey boxes, small tiny text, and a plethora of options that I had no idea about. On top of that, Final Cut at the time wasn't exactly bug-free, still isn't, and it made learning that much harder. Although now I feel like the bugs were just there to train my patience all along. Okay, to be fair though, Final Cut was a good program. It was well thought out and the layout and functions made sense for the workflow. I still remember it fondly as the program that allowed me to advance into a proper editing suite from something like iMovie. I used Apple hardware and software for the first few years of learning editing, but this was only because I was able to use Macs and their software at school. After school, I used my brother's MacBook Pro for a little bit, then I moved on to PC. PC is just so much cheaper and more transparent for the user. I was a recent graduate when I made the change. I wasn't going to pay double for a Mac just to use Final Cut. This meant I was moving on to Premiere. Thankfully, a few years later, I made the switch. Premiere had its historical breakout with the CUDA core technology. I still remember going to the Adobe conference and seeing the hardware acceleration demonstration for the first time. It is nothing to rave about these days, but in that conference room back then, all of the editors in the crowd were amazed. Since switching to Premiere Pro, I have used it as my main program for the better part of my pro career. I have edited countless projects on it, and it was a good platform for me to develop my skills as an editor. The layout is really quite straightforward and not that hard to understand, but has almost all the functions that you could ask for from an editing program. Wasn't always the case, but now it also has a lot of built-in functions like Lumetri Color and audio plugins. I have loved it, hated it, loathed it, sworn by it, so many different phases. It is far from perfect. Really annoying bugs and errors, crashes, a lot of crashed. I started using DaVinci Resolve for any projects that needed proper color grading. Then Blackmagic rolled out the editing part of Resolve. I thought about switching to Resolve from Premiere entirely, but I was just faster in Premiere because I was used to it. The other thing was I was editing on an old machine when I first learned to use DaVinci, and it needed good hardware to run smoothly. I didn't have the best experience, so I'm using it whenever I need to color grade, but for editing I am still using Premiere. For me, learning to be an editor meant learning about computers at the same time. Mastering just one editing program and one program only might have been okay in an ideal world, but the reality is I had to learn to use many other programs as well. I learned to troubleshoot errors and crashes. I googled very specific questions, God knows how many times in a day, and I still do. I learned to maintain my computer, both hardware and software. I read about codecs, color spaces, bit depth, bit rates, frame rates, time codes, etc. Over time, with practice, I learned how all these video aspects work with different software and hardware. So I think it is good to learn about computers in general if you are thinking about getting into editing, but not too savvy with computers, but mostly just learn how to Google and solve problems. One other thing I really want to recommend before learning any video program is learning to use Photoshop. I was fortunate enough to start learning Photoshop when I was 13. Sending kids to cram school for a variety of subjects was a trend at the time in Korea. I need to thank my mom. Photoshop is quite a complex, powerful tool, but if you know how to use the basic functions of Photoshop, it will really ease the learning curve when you start using video editing programs. Also, it is an essential tool for an editor anyway. What is your favorite editing program? Do you edit on PC or Mac? Let me know in the comments below. I am always up for a PC versus Apple discussion.